What if the greatest miracles in life are the ones we've overlooked? Hidden in the pages of the Bible are extraordinary moments of God's power, waiting to remind us that He is present in every season, no matter how small or forgotten we feel. The life of Elisha is one such treasure, filled with stories of faith, provision, and hope that still speak to our hearts today. Perhaps you've been in a place of emptiness, loss, or uncertainty, wondering where God is in the middle of it all. Elisha's journey reveals that God moves in the miraculous and the mundane, using ordinary people and situations to accomplish extraordinary things. From oil that never ran dry to life restored when hope was gone, these stories are powerful reminders that God sees you, cares for you, and is working behind the scenes, even when you can't see it yet. Today, we'll uncover the forgotten miracles of Elisha and the timeless lessons they hold for your life. If you're ready to rediscover God's faithfulness, renew your hope, and embrace the truth that miracles are still possible, let's walk this journey together. You are not alone, and these stories may be just what your heart needs to hear today. There are moments in life when we stand on the edge of something new and unknown. Maybe it's a change we didn't ask for, or perhaps it's the fulfillment of a dream we've long waited for. For Elisha, this pivotal moment came in the form of a simple, worn-out mantle dropped on his shoulders. But that mantle wasn't just fabric, it was a symbol of God's call to a greater purpose. Have you ever felt like you were being called into something bigger, even if you didn't feel ready? Elisha was a farmer, a man of the land, content with plowing his fields. When the prophet Elijah approached him and placed his mantle over him, it was a bold invitation. In biblical times, a mantle represented authority, responsibility, and divine calling. For Elisha, it was the moment when his ordinary life collided with God's extraordinary plan. He left everything behind, his oxen, his fields, his comfort, and stepped forward in faith. Can you imagine the courage it took to walk away from everything familiar? This story reminds us that sometimes God's call comes when we least expect it. Elisha wasn't waiting on a mountaintop or in a temple. He was working in the fields, getting his hands dirty. God often meets us in the middle of our daily routines, nudging us toward His greater plan. Perhaps you too have felt a stirring in your heart, a whisper of something more. Are you ready to say yes, like Elisha, even if you don't have all the answers? Elisha's decision to follow Elijah was not a half-hearted one. He sacrificed his oxen and burned his plow, a powerful symbol of leaving the past behind. This act of surrender showed his commitment to God's call. How many times do we hold onto our plows, old habits, comfort zones, or doubts when God is asking us to move forward? Letting go is never easy, but it's often the first step towards something incredible. For women walking through seasons of transition, Elisha's story offers comfort and hope. God sees your faithfulness in the ordinary moments of life, and He can use you in ways you never imagined. Maybe you're stepping into a new role, facing a life change, or being called to serve others in a deeper way. Whatever it is, trust that God's mantle of purpose is upon you. He equips those He calls. As Elisha walked away from his fields and followed Elijah, he didn't know what the journey would hold, but he trusted the one who called him. God doesn't promise that the path will be easy, but He does promise to walk it with us. If you feel like you're standing on the edge of something new, remember Elisha. The same God who called him is calling you to step forward in faith. Have you ever felt a moment where you had to leave something behind to embrace God's calling? Maybe it's happening now. Take a moment to reflect on what God might be asking of you. It could be as simple as saying a prayer, helping someone in need, or taking a leap into something bigger. He sees you, and He will guide you. Have you ever felt like you had nothing left to give? Like the weight of life's challenges had drained you completely? There's a story in the Bible about a widow who faced this very reality: empty hands, an empty house, and what felt like an empty future. But through her faith and obedience, God turned her not enough into overflowing abundance. It's a story of hope for anyone who feels like they're running on empty. The widow's situation was desperate. Her husband had passed away, leaving her with debts she couldn't repay. To make matters worse, creditors threatened to take her 2 sons as slaves. Can you imagine the fear and helplessness she must have felt? Perhaps you've been there too, facing circumstances that seem impossible. When Elisha asked her what she had, she replied, "Nothing at all, except a small jar of olive oil." That nothing became the very tool God used to change her life. Elisha's instructions were simple yet profound. Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. He then told her to pour the little oil she had into the jars. Here's the beauty of God's work. He often asks us to take small steps of faith before he reveals his miracle. Can you imagine the widow's uncertainty as she gathered jar after jar? But she obeyed. What small steps might God be asking you to take today? As the widow began pouring, something miraculous happened. The oil didn't run out. Jar after jar, the oil flowed until every empty vessel was full. Then, and only then, the oil stopped. God's provision matched her faith and preparation. It's a reminder that when we bring God our emptiness, our fears, our lack, our brokenness, he fills us with his abundance. He doesn't need much. He just needs our willingness to trust him. This story holds a powerful lesson. Sometimes we focus so much on what we lack that we forget what we still have. The widow thought her small jar of oil was insignificant, but God saw it as the beginning of a miracle. Maybe you feel like you don't have much to offer, just a little strength, a little time, or a little faith. But in God's hands, even a small jar can overflow. What small jar are you holding onto today that God can use? For women who have faced loss, financial struggles, or moments of emptiness, this story speaks directly to the heart. God sees your needs. He hears your prayers. And just as he provided for the widow, he will provide for you. Sometimes his provision comes through unexpected ways, like a friend's encouragement, a door opening at the right moment, or a quiet sense of peace in the middle of the storm. Imagine the widow's joy as she sold the oil, paid her debts, and secured a future for her sons. What began as emptiness became a testimony of God's faithfulness. Her story reminds us that no situation is too desperate for God to redeem. If you feel like you're running on empty, bring what little you have to him. Trust that he will pour out his blessings in ways you can't yet see. Have you ever experienced a moment when your faith was tested beyond what you thought possible? The Shunammite woman's story is one of unwavering trust, even in the face of unimaginable loss. Her journey reminds us that faith doesn't shield us from hardship, but it does give us the strength to face it. The Shunammite woman was a wealthy and kind-hearted individual who extended hospitality to Elisha. She and her husband prepared a small room for the prophet to stay whenever he passed through their town. Moved by her generosity, Elisha asked what he could do for her. Though she didn't ask for anything, Elisha discovered her silent sorrow. She was childless. In that moment, he declared that within a year, she would hold a son in her arms. Imagine the mix of disbelief and hope she must have felt. Have you ever dared to hope for something so precious that it scared you? Just as Elisha promised, the woman gave birth to a son. Her joy was complete, but as the child grew, tragedy struck. One day, he suddenly fell ill and died in her lap. It's hard to imagine the heartbreak she experienced in that moment. But instead of giving in to despair, she did something remarkable. She laid her son on Elisha's bed, closed the door, and set out to find the prophet. "It is well," she told those who asked about her situation. Her words weren't a denial of the pain. She was speaking from a place of deep, steadfast faith. When the Shunammite woman reached Elisha, she fell at his feet, pouring out her grief. Elisha saw her faith and persistence and returned to her home. There, through his prayers and God's power, the boy was miraculously brought back to life. This moment is a powerful reminder that even when all hope seems lost, God can restore what has been broken. Have you ever experienced a season where you needed to hold on to God's promises despite overwhelming circumstances? What makes this story so inspiring is the Shunammite woman's determination. She didn't accept her loss as the final word. Instead, she sought God's help with unwavering faith. Her example encourages us to bring our pain, doubts, and deepest needs before Him, trusting in His ability to heal, restore, and renew. Sometimes the miracle isn't immediate, but faith teaches us to keep walking forward. If you're walking through a difficult season right now, perhaps grieving a loss, facing disappointment, or holding on to a promise that hasn't yet been fulfilled, take heart. The Shunammite woman's story reminds us that God sees your tears and hears your prayers. He may not always answer in the way we expect, but His timing and purpose are perfect. Faith doesn't mean the absence of pain. It means holding on to hope in the one who brings life from death. If this message touched your heart, share with us how faith has guided you through seasons of loss or hardship. Leave a comment below, or simply write the word restoration to let us know you're walking this journey of faith with us. And if you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more messages of hope and inspiration. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where everything seemed to be going wrong and panic threatened to take over? The story of Elisha and the poisoned pot is a powerful reminder that God is present even in the most unexpected crises. He has a way of turning what seems harmful into something good, if only we trust Him to intervene. This event took place during a time of famine. Elisha was with a group of prophets who were preparing a meal. One of them, perhaps eager to contribute, gathered wild gourds and unknowingly added poisonous ingredients to the pot. It wasn't until they began to eat that someone cried out, "Man of God, there is death in the pot." Imagine the fear and confusion spreading through the group at that moment. Have you ever felt like your efforts backfired, or that something seemingly small spiraled into a crisis? Elisha's response was calm and full of faith. Without hesitation, he asked for flour to be brought to him. He sprinkled it into the pot and instructed the group to eat. The food, once deadly, became safe to consume, and the crisis was averted. This moment demonstrates that God's power can transform even the most dangerous circumstances. What poisoned pot are you facing today? Perhaps a broken relationship, financial stress, or a situation that feels overwhelming. God can purify and redeem it. The flour Elisha used was not a magical ingredient. It was a symbol of obedience and trust in God's ability to provide a solution. Sometimes God asks us to take simple steps of faith, like adding flour to the problem, praying earnestly, forgiving someone, or extending kindness when it feels undeserved. It may seem small, but obedience often opens the door for God's miraculous intervention. This story also teaches us the importance of community. The prophets were gathered together, sharing what little they had in a time of scarcity. Even though the situation took a sudden turn, they weren't alone. God used Elisha to guide and protect them. For those walking through crises, this is a reminder that you don't have to carry the burden alone. God often works through others to bring solutions, comfort, and hope. Think about the wild gourds in your own life. Those things that may have been introduced unintentionally but brought pain or difficulty. Maybe it's a decision you made without realizing the consequences or circumstances outside your control. The good news is that nothing is beyond God's ability to heal or restore. Elisha's actions show us that when we invite God into our situations, He can transform what was meant for harm into something life-giving. The next time you find yourself in a crisis, remember this story. Instead of panicking, pause and pray. God is not surprised by your situation, and His solutions often come in unexpected ways. He is the God who brings healing to poisoned pots and peace to chaotic hearts. Trust Him to intervene, and don't underestimate the power of small steps of faith. Have you ever found yourself needing help but struggled to ask for it? Or perhaps you received an answer that wasn't what you expected and pride got in the way. Naaman's story is a powerful reminder that humility often opens the door to God's healing and grace. His journey from sickness to restoration reveals how God's plans are sometimes simple, but require us to let go of our pride. Naaman was a highly respected commander of the Syrian army, powerful, wealthy, and admired. But beneath his armor and reputation was a secret. He suffered from leprosy, a disease that isolated and shamed its victims. Can you imagine how helpless he must have felt? His wealth and influence couldn't buy him a cure. No matter how strong or capable we are, life has a way of reminding us of our limitations. Have you ever felt like your strength wasn't enough to solve your problem? The solution to Naaman's problem came from an unlikely source, a young servant girl. This girl, a captive from Israel, had every reason to remain silent. But instead, she spoke with compassion and faith, saying, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Isn't it humbling that God often uses the least likely people to point us toward his solutions? Sometimes, wisdom comes from the mouths of those we overlook. Naaman eventually traveled to see Elisha, full of hope and expectation. But instead of a grand gesture, Elisha sent a simple message: "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored." Naaman was furious. He expected a dramatic miracle, not a command to bathe in the muddy Jordan River. How often do we miss God's answers because they don't look the way we imagined? Pride can blind us to the very thing God is using to heal and restore us. Thankfully, Naaman's servants convinced him to humble himself and obey Elisha's instructions. Reluctantly, he dipped in the Jordan 7 times. With each step into the water, he laid down his pride, his doubts, and his resistance. And when he emerged, his skin was clean and restored, like that of a young boy. Naaman's healing wasn't just physical, it was also spiritual. His act of obedience brought him face to face with God's power and mercy. Naaman's story reminds us that healing often begins with humility. Sometimes God asks us to take simple steps that test our faith and obedience. Maybe it's reaching out to someone for help, forgiving a hurt that seems unforgivable, or trusting him in a way that feels uncomfortable. The path to restoration isn't always grand or dramatic, but it's always worth it. For anyone facing challenges, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, Naaman's journey offers hope. God's power is not limited, and his solutions often surprise us. He calls us to come to him just as we are, lay down our pride, and trust his ways. Are there areas in your life where God is asking you to dip in the Jordan, to take a step of faith that feels small or humbling? Remember, even the smallest acts of obedience can lead to miraculous outcomes. Have you ever hesitated to pray about something small, thinking it wasn't important enough to bring to God? Sometimes we assume that God only cares about the big, life-altering issues. Yet the story of the floating axe head reminds us that God is concerned with every detail of our lives, big and small. His love reaches into the smallest crises to remind us that nothing is beyond his care. The story begins with a group of prophets who were building a larger meeting place near the Jordan River. As one of the men worked, his borrowed axe head flew off the handle and sank into the river. He cried out in distress, saying, "Oh no, my lord, it was borrowed." This may seem like a minor inconvenience, but for the man, it was a serious issue. Tools were valuable in those days, and losing something borrowed was not only embarrassing but also a financial burden. Have you ever felt the weight of a small problem that suddenly seemed much bigger? Elisha's response shows God's tender concern. Instead of dismissing the man's worry as trivial, Elisha asked where the axe head fell. He cut a stick, threw it into the water, and miraculously the axe head floated to the surface. The man reached out and retrieved it. Just like that, what was lost was restored. Isn't it amazing to know that God sees and responds to even the little moments of our lives? This story reminds us that nothing is too small for his attention. How often do we minimize our concerns, thinking they don't matter to God? Whether it's a lost item, a stressful errand, or a small personal challenge, God's care is constant. He doesn't measure our needs by size or importance. If it matters to you, it matters to Him. This truth brings incredible comfort, especially during seasons when life feels overwhelming and even the little things start to add up. The floating axe head also speaks to God's power in the ordinary. Elisha didn't perform an elaborate ritual, he simply acted in faith. Sometimes God's miracles don't come with fanfare, they happen quietly, in the middle of everyday life. Maybe you've experienced this in moments when you found a solution to a problem just in time, received unexpected help, or felt a sense of peace when you needed it most. These are reminders of God's quiet but constant presence. This story is especially encouraging for those of us who feel like our struggles are too small to bother God with. Whether it's a minor setback, a frustrating day, or a seemingly insignificant worry, God invites us to bring everything to Him in prayer. His love doesn't have limits or conditions. He cares about the big storms of life and the small ripples that disrupt our peace. If you're carrying a concern, big or small, take a moment to bring it before God. Picture Him standing with you at the water's edge, ready to help you recover what feels lost. He's a God who restores, who intervenes, and who cares deeply about every detail of your life. Trust Him, even in the little things, because to Him, nothing about you is insignificant. Have you ever faced a situation where you felt surrounded, outnumbered, and powerless? In those moments, it's easy to focus on what we see with our physical eyes: problems, fear, and uncertainty. But the story of Elisha and the Aramean army reminds us of a powerful truth. God is always fighting for us, even when we cannot see Him. This event begins when the king of Aram sent a great army to capture Elisha. The prophet had been warning the king of Israel about the Arameans' plans, frustrating their every move. Furious, the king of Aram sent soldiers, horses, and chariots to surround the city where Elisha was staying. Imagine waking up to see an army surrounding you on every side. That's exactly what happened to Elisha's servant. Overcome with fear, he cried out, "Oh no, my lord, what shall we do?" Have you ever felt like you were surrounded by problems with no way out? Elisha's response is one of calm faith. Don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. At first, his words must have sounded confusing. To the servant, there was no sign of help, just the enemy closing in. But Elisha knew something his servant didn't. He prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." And in that moment, the servant's eyes were opened to the unseen reality. The hills were full of horses and chariots of fire, God's heavenly army surrounding them. What a powerful moment. When the servant's eyes were opened, he realized that they were not alone. God's protection had been there all along, even though he couldn't see it at first. This story challenges us to shift our focus from the visible to the invisible. How often do we allow fear to blind us to the truth of God's presence? Even when we feel surrounded by problems, God surrounds us with His strength and protection. Elisha's faith in God's unseen power was unwavering, and through his prayers, the enemy was struck with blindness. Elisha then led them straight to the king of Israel, where they were fed and released instead of being harmed. This act of mercy not only demonstrated God's power, but also turned enemies into allies. Sometimes God's solutions go beyond what we imagine. Instead of destroying the enemy, He transforms the situation into something better. For women facing overwhelming situations, whether it's family struggles, financial pressures, or emotional battles, this story is a powerful reminder to ask God to open our spiritual eyes. Often, we focus on what feels impossible instead of seeing the ways God is working on our behalf. His angels, His protection, and His presence are surrounding you even now. When life feels overwhelming, take a moment to pray, "Lord, open my eyes so I may see." Ask Him to give you faith to trust what you cannot yet see. God's army is greater than the forces against you, and His protection is constant. You are never alone. What situation in your life feels overwhelming right now? Remember, God is surrounding you with His love, His power, and His unseen provision. Have you ever felt trapped in a situation that seemed hopeless? The people of Samaria knew exactly what that felt like. Under siege by the Aramean army, they were starving, desperate, and surrounded by despair. This story teaches us that even in the darkest of times, God's miracles can break through and provide a way where there seems to be none. The siege of Samaria was brutal. The city was completely cut off, and the people were left with nothing. Hunger and hopelessness consumed their lives. Mothers were making heartbreaking choices, and the king himself was overwhelmed with grief and anger. In moments of deep desperation, it's easy to lose sight of God. Have you ever felt so weighed down by circumstances that you wondered if God was still there? You're not alone. Samaria's people felt the same. Elisha, however, delivered a message of hope from God. This time tomorrow, a measure of flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. In other words, the famine would end, and provision would come overnight. To the people, this sounded impossible. How could such a dire situation turn around so quickly? When life presses us with impossible odds, God reminds us that His power isn't limited by what we see or understand. Meanwhile, 4 lepers sat outside the city gate, excluded from society and desperate for survival. With nothing left to lose, they decided to enter the Aramean camp, thinking, if they spare us, we live. If they kill us, we die. What they found shocked them. The camp was abandoned. God had caused the Arameans to hear the sound of a mighty army, and in their fear, they fled, leaving behind food, supplies, and treasure. Isn't it incredible how God can use the most unexpected ways to deliver His miracles? These 4 outcasts, the least likely of heroes, became the bearers of good news. They returned to the city and shared the miracle. The famine was over, and provision had come. This part of the story is so powerful. It reminds us that God often uses unlikely people to bring hope and answers. Who in your life might God be using to bring you encouragement or help? When the people of Samaria heard the news, they rushed to the Aramean camp and found everything Elisha had promised: food, supplies, and relief. A day that began in desperation ended in miraculous provision. It's a beautiful reminder that no situation is too desperate for God to turn around. Even when the odds seem impossible, He can bring deliverance and abundance. If you're feeling trapped in your own siege, whether it's a financial crisis, a broken relationship, or emotional exhaustion, know that God is still at work. His timing is perfect, and His miracles often come when we least expect them. Just as He provided for Samaria, He can provide for you. Trust Him to bring hope and restoration into your life, even when the path seems unclear. Have you ever felt like something in your life was over? An opportunity, a dream, or a season of purpose? The story of Elisha's bones shows us that God's power doesn't end. Even when everything seems finished, His miracles can spring forth from the most unexpected places, bringing new life and hope when we least expect it. Elisha's ministry had been marked by powerful miracles, from healing the sick to raising the dead. Yet, even after he passed away, God wasn't finished using him. The Bible tells us that Elisha was buried, and sometime later, a group of men were burying another person when they saw a raiding band of Moabites approaching. In a hurry, they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb. What happened next was astounding. The moment the man's body touched Elisha's bones, he came back to life and stood up. Imagine the shock and awe of those who witnessed this miracle. This extraordinary event reveals something profound. God's power is not limited by time, circumstances, or even death itself. Elisha's physical life had ended, but God's work through him was still active. How often do we assume that something is dead in our lives? A dream we've buried, a prayer that hasn't been answered, or a purpose we think has passed us by. This story reminds us that with God, nothing is ever truly over. His power can bring life to what feels forgotten or finished. Elisha's legacy teaches us that our faith and obedience leave a lasting impact, even beyond our lifetime. You may not always see the full fruit of your faithfulness right away, but God uses every act of obedience to accomplish His greater purpose. Your prayers, your kindness, your service, they all plant seeds that can bring life to others, even in ways you may never know. Have you ever thought about how your faith could impact future generations? For women who feel overlooked, forgotten, or weary, this story brings renewed hope. God sees you, and He is still at work in your life. Just as Elisha's bones were a vessel of God's power, you too can be used by Him to bring life and hope to others. Perhaps there's someone in your life who needs encouragement, a prayer, or a simple reminder of God's love. Your willingness to act can spark miracles in ways you may not even realize. Sometimes we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, what dreams or purposes have I buried? Is there something God wants to revive in my life? Whether it's a passion to serve, a broken relationship, or faith that feels dry, trust that God can breathe new life into it. He specializes in bringing resurrection to what seems lifeless. As you reflect on this story, take heart in knowing that God's power is limitless. What feels finished to us is not finished to Him. Trust Him to revive what needs to be restored in your life and to use you as a vessel of hope for others. Even when you feel unseen or overlooked, remember that God is still writing your story, and His miracles can come through you in ways you never imagined. When we look back on Elisha's life, we see more than a prophet who performed miracles. We see a man who lived with purpose, faith, and a deep trust in God. From the moment he accepted Elijah's mantle to the miracles that happened after his death, Elisha's life reminds us of the power of obedience, perseverance, and living fully for God's calling. Have you ever wondered what kind of legacy your life will leave behind? Elisha's journey began with a simple decision to leave everything behind and follow God's calling. He gave up his comfortable life as a farmer, burned his plow, and stepped into the unknown. This act of surrender set the foundation for a life that would impact generations to come. Perhaps God is calling you to let go of something today, an old fear, a habit, or a comfort zone, to embrace a new purpose. What step of faith might you need to take? Throughout his ministry, Elisha displayed unwavering faith. He trusted God in times of famine, performed miracles for the poor, and even stood fearless before armies. His faith was not about his own power, but about his confidence in God's ability to work through him. You don't have to perform miracles to live a life of impact. A kind word, a prayer, or an act of compassion can be powerful tools in God's hands. What small but faithful actions can you take today to bless those around you? Elisha's legacy also speaks to the importance of perseverance. He didn't always see immediate results, but he continued to trust God's plan. Whether it was healing Naaman, providing for the widow, or confronting kings, Elisha remained steadfast. For those of us facing seasons of uncertainty or hardship, his life reminds us to keep going. God is at work, even when we don't see it. Have you ever found that the moments you persevered in faith became turning points in your journey? Perhaps one of the most inspiring parts of Elisha's story is what happened after his death. The miracle of the man coming back to life after touching Elisha's bones is a symbol of lasting impact. Even after we're gone, the seeds we plant through our faith and obedience can continue to grow. Whether it's raising children, serving in your community, or sharing your story of faith, you are leaving a legacy. Have you thought about how God might use your life to impact others? Elisha's life teaches us that living with purpose means trusting God's plan, even when it's unclear. It means showing up every day, ready to serve, pray, and believe in His power. You may not feel extraordinary, but God can use ordinary people in extraordinary ways. Like Elisha, your faith can ripple out and bring hope, healing, and transformation to others. As we reflect on Elisha's legacy, let's ask ourselves, What kind of impact do I want to leave? What steps can I take today to live with greater faith and purpose? Your story, like Elisha's, can be a testimony of God's love and power. Trust Him to use you in ways that extend far beyond what you can imagine. The life and miracles of Elisha remind us of a timeless truth. God's power knows no limits, and His faithfulness reaches every corner of our lives. From the widow's overflowing oil to the resurrection through Elisha's bones, these stories teach us that God works in ways we cannot always see, turning moments of emptiness, loss, and fear into testimonies of hope, restoration, and purpose. Maybe you find yourself in a place where you're waiting for a miracle, big or small. Let this be your reminder that God sees you. He is still working, still moving, and still performing miracles in the everyday moments of your life. Hold on to faith as Elisha did, and trust that God's plans for you are far greater than you can imagine. Let's take a moment to pray together. Lord, thank you for reminding us that you are with us in every season. Strengthen our faith to trust in your promises, even when we cannot see the way forward. Help us to believe in your power to restore, provide, and guide us. Open our hearts to see your miracles, big and small, and to walk in obedience to your call. In Jesus' name, amen. Bees, if these stories have inspired you, share this message with someone who needs to hear it. Let's spread hope, faith, and encouragement together. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss future content that will lift your spirit and deepen your faith.